dynamic that's at play? How has anything changed since we last spoke? And what's it look like right now?
So immigration court continues to be a high stress situation for a lot of people who are going to their hearings. So when somebody is trying to pursue some sort of immigration status and they are coming into the United States at a point of entry at a border, they're often placed into immigration removal proceedings. That's the immigration court, and they have their cases heard in front of a judge. There's some variation on that depending on the particular situation and the particular facts for each case. But for the most part, these are people who are kind of following the law, following what they're supposed to do, and showing up for their appointments. There's continued to be a lot of dismissals for people who have been in good faith, going to immigration court, showing up at their hearings. That is something that generally we would want to encourage, right? Like we want to have people have their cases heard by an impartial adjudicator who is trained in the law, who understands the system, and can decide whether or not they should grant or deny some form of immigration relief. Um, Instead, what's happening is a lot of the attention and a lot of the arrests by ICE in immigration courts ends up creating a situation where somebody has to decide if they're going to go to immigration court. If they don't go to immigration court, they'll probably be ordered removed from the United States. So there will have a deportation order against them, which is not good. They're very difficult to open. And people generally won't be able to pursue things that they would have been able to pursue if they were to continue in their proceedings. It also creates, a lot of apprehension for people around like what is going to happen in each hearing. Instead, what's happening is people are getting arrested. Their cases are getting dismissed a lot of the time, which allows ICE to put them into a kind of sidetracked, short-tracked proceeding that gets around seeing the immigration judge. There was a recent lawsuit, and one of the declarations that was filed from a former immigration judge who was an immigration judge from 2023 until last July. And he stated in that declaration that he had received orders from his supervisors, so from the judges above him, that he should be granting those requests from ICE to dismiss cases, which shows the extent to which the immigration court system, which really is underneath the Department of Justice, which is a prosecutorial agency under the executive branch, and the Department of Homeland Security, which is a law enforcement agency also under the executive branch. The amount of control and the amount of the extent to which things can shift very quickly because it's coming from the executive, and the orders are kind of coming from the executive, both for the prosecuting agency, which is in this case DHS, and the adjudicative agency, which in this situation is the immigration courts. So if an immigration judge is ordered to dismiss a case and the prosecutor or the trial attorney in immigration court is asking to dismiss the case, there's very little that somebody who's a respondent can do that is to contest that. That's kind of one of the big things that's happened recently, and I think that it shows the extent to which it's a system that's really banked against respondents, and makes it very, very difficult for them to get a hearing. It's especially important to consider in these proceedings. This is not criminal law, and people don't get access to attorneys for free the way that they do if they're in criminal court with a public defender. So there's no appointed counsel. People often don't speak English and they have to represent themselves in these proceedings. There's been a huge drop in representation for people in immigration courts. So it's now down to about, I think, 30% of people are represented, which means that, 70% of people aren't represented. And that is um, a problem for not just the people who are trying to get relief, who are eligible for relief, who may not know the precise words that they're supposed to say to actually get the thing that they need, which is a lot of what the lawyer's job would be. But it's difficult for the judges, it's difficult for the prosecuting attorneys to make sure that it is a fair system, because they don't have equal representation.
The judge question is really interesting to me, because you hear all the time, and not even in this vein, but judges say they're constrained by wording of legislation. But you're saying here that they are given an order, or given guidance from a superior, if you will, so the super whoever it's going to be. I guess, is there wording that they should be following and they might not be, or are they just taking advantage of that and interpreting it through that order in a way that allows more dismissals, if that makes sense, that question?
Yeah, so that is, I think, the core question of what the law is and what the role of a judge is. The thing that's distinct with immigration judges is that they are administrative law judges housed within a prosecutorial agency. They're not general, like, federal courts in the way that, like, the Northern District of New York is its own standalone Article 3 court. It doesn't have it doesn't have any oversight or superseding authority from, like, the executive, right? It's a standalone, one of the three standalone branches of government. Immigration courts, on the other hand, are administrative. They are under the executive, and they are really subject to the discretion of the executive. There is a really The executive branch has a lot of authority with regards to immigration in particular, much more so than really any other type of law, or really any other obligation that they undertake. Because of that, there is a lot of discretion that they have in terms of changing the way that the adjudication process works. So there's regulations. There's the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the statute that creates the obligations and delegates authority to the agencies to create rules and regulations, create policies. Um, what ends up happening, though, is, the statute covers so much. Um, the rules, which has to go through a notice and comment period, they have to be written. They are agency guidance, formal agency guidance that really articulates how an agency is going to do something. And those are not quickly changed, but they can be changed pretty without involving Congress. Um, then underneath that, there's kind of the policy guidance, and that's the interpretation of the statute and the regulations. And that's kind of where a lot of what's happening right now is changing. So the Department of Justice can, and the Attorney General can really change the way that they're interpreting law to change the way that the policies and the law ends up kind of coming out. So in a lot of circumstances recently, there's been a rollback of the way that either DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, or Department of Justice, DOJ, are interpreting the law, even if it's been longstanding for like 50 years. The current administration is going through and they're saying, okay, well, even though we have interpreted from the DOJ, or from the kind of attorneys who are overseeing the immigration prosecution, even though we've interpreted this law one way for 50 years, we're now going to say we think that that was a wrong interpretation and the law should be applied this other way. And so that's a problem because it creates inconsistencies and it really undermines the predictability of the process. Not to mention, there's been a lot of reliance on the government interpreting certain laws in a certain way because they have themselves said that they are interpreting it. Like a lot of these are official policy, like issued guidance on the interpretation of certain cases or certain statutes. And it is it's difficult to trust a government that is so changeable in that way. I think another thing that is less widely known, but is also important to understand the scope of the power of the executive in this situation is that if a certain decision by an immigration judge or um, potentially the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the appellate body within the DOJ, if the Attorney General has an opinion about the way that a law should be applied in a certain case, they can certify the appeal or decision to themselves, and then issue the policy and issue the decision on their own. So, for instance, Bondi could certify a decision to herself and write that decision, which kind of shows the amount of authority that the DOJ has. That's, again, the adjudicating body. It's the supposedly impartial courts that are supposed to be that are supposedly impartial that are also under the DOJ that are subject to those interpretations as well as DHS.
Right. So, and that's where like the Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's become a political, lightning rod, the DOJ gets involved, even though a judge might rule whatever, right? Is that
That's
applicable?
actually a different,
It is.
so yeah, that's a different situation because and this is where things get really complicated and it's difficult for even attorneys, even, law students. I teach law students every day and showing and identifying the many ways that the agencies overlap and the potential conflicts. So that the distinction there is that a lot of that case is taking place in a federal court. So it's not necessarily taking place in an immigration court. It's taking place in a federal court, an Article 3 court that is not underneath the DOJ. In that circumstance, the U.S. attorneys are representing the government in immigration court. They are within the DOJ. So it shows that the kind of prosecuting agency in federal court is the same agency that is the adjudicative impartial agency that makes the decisions on people's immigration cases. They're the one and the same. And I think it demonstrates the extent to which things are really backed against people.
Yeah, back to that aspect. First I wanted to ask, these judges that you speak of, are they elected or appointed?
So federal judges are appointed.
Right.
All federal judges are appointed,
Okay.
whether they're on the district court level, the appellate court level, the
Okay.
Supreme Court level. And the immigration judges are also appointed. So they are appointed through a different process, but they still go through an application and appointment process. There's been some advocacy around changing the immigration court structure so that it is a truly impartial body. But so far that hasn't really caught on in the way that I think it should.
In terms of the dismissals, are grounds needed? Or do they have to have a grounds for dismissal, and what are they if that's the case?
Generally, in the same vein as a criminal prosecution, although distinct, the prosecuting agency, the prosecutor has a lot of discretion in terms of what they want to pursue. So generally, if there is a criminal case and the district attorney goes in and they say, actually, we don't want to prosecute this case anymore. We're not going to pursue it. There's very little that a judge can do in that situation, right? The prosecutor just basically drops the case. In a similar vein, the prosecuting agency, ICE, in immigration court has the discretion to generally make certain accommodations around certain cases. They can agree to things. They can not pursue cases in a certain way. They can really have a broad authority and broad discretion to make those judgment calls. What we're seeing now is a lot more direction to do certain things and take certain steps that make it more difficult for people to pursue their cases in court. So with the dismissals, generally those are happening to people who are subject to expedited removal. So they've entered without inspection and they're in the United States for less than 2 years. Um, Theoretically, the ICE attorney could agree to dismiss a case that was outside of those parameters.
Okay. When it comes to this zero border crossings or some of the statistics you might be seeing when it comes to that or being hearing at this point, what does that mean to you? When you hear that or understand what is happening there, that would lead to that kind of a stat, if you will, or a decrease in that.
Yeah, I the statistics are gathered by Customs and Border Protection. Um, those are released on a regular basis. It's an obligation for CBP and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which enforces the immigration law within the country. So CBP does the border, and then Immigration and Customs Enforcement does the interior. Um, those are required to be released. They count encounters. So if you think about the ways I only did a college level stats course, but generally, if you select, if you don't have a large pool, and you are selecting the pool, you get to decide who is in and outside of the numbers that you count. Right. So I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind when we're looking at these statistics. It is encounters. So theoretically, if CBP or Border Patrol, which is a sub-agency of CBP, um, the field offices of CBP are the offices that kind of look at and admit or deny people entering the country at ports of entry. And then Border Patrol is the agency, sub-agency that patrols between ports of entry.
Mm.
Uh, so if CBP just doesn't go out for a month and they sit in their office and they watch TV all day, that would indicate that they have like not encountered anyone, which in one situation could be interpreted as there's nobody who is crossing. On the other hand, it could also be interpreted they're just not doing a very good job because they're sitting in their office and watching TV. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but that is important to keep in mind when we're looking at these statistics. Um, I am not as familiar with the quote about like zero border crossings that you had used. Um, I looked at CBP's statistics, and they are still apprehending people who have entered without inspection. So people are entering, and they are being arrested on entry or shortly thereafter. Those are going to be people who are subject to expedited removal for the most part. And so they are probably not going to be able to get a hearing in immigration court. They're going to probably be removed from the United States, um, basically just on the order of the interviewing immigration officer.
But people can still come, right? Like, I think that that's kind of the feel. It's like, well, is anybody allowed to come in anymore and become a citizen, right? Like that's still available to people, right?
Yes, I mean, yes, it is. theoretically, I think it is becoming more difficult at every level to get a visa, get a green card, and become naturalized.
Right.
And
It plays
so,
into what we were talking about before, right? Just
yeah,
the barriers to that. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
Um, and I think one thing that is very telling is that there's a lot less tourism. People don't want to come. People from wealthy nations, wealthy countries in Europe are less interested in coming to the United States because they are afraid that they are going to end up in ICE detention. And I think that that is a valid fear that a lot of people have given the number of people it has happened to. Um, and I think that that is something that is deeply concerning.
Before we go, I wanted to also ask about the halting of the issuing of work visas for the truck drivers, the commercial truck drivers. What is your understanding of that and what that looks like? Or I guess when it comes to, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about driver's licenses being valid, and how that all works. The green light law, converse. What does that look like to you when you see that policy come across in the name of what they're calling safety?
Yeah, so I think that it is getting conflated into a flat issue that doesn't um necessarily respond to some of the concerns that were brought up. My understanding is that that came about and Marco Rubio, I believe, started calling for the kind of commercial driver's license or CDLs to not go to immigrants because of an accident in Florida where allegedly um, the person who was driving the truck was undocumented. Um, it is one, the green light law, so New York's law that allows people, regardless of immigration status, to get a non-real ID driver's license is, I think, the best approach to making sure that people have the training to drive. They have licenses to drive. They've been through all of the steps needed in order to meet the standards of anybody else on the road, right? I would um, be much more concerned about like a 17-year-old driving on the road than I would most people who have probably driven in their home country.
Yeah.
Uh, see, green light doesn't apply to CDLs, so they don't apply to driver's licenses. But I think if the concern is that people don't have the training and they're going to make things more dangerous on the road, I don't think that the response is to shut down and make it more difficult for people um, to get that training. I think that the appropriate response is to make that training more available because employers and people are going to, I think, try to survive. And I think that people are going to try to survive. They're going to try to work. And I think that it is a lot better to open the door to making sure that people have the information and skills that they need to keep things safe and to make that more accessible than to just try to shut everything down.
Yeah, it's interesting because you look at an economic standpoint, this is a big portion of the economy too. I mean, to have people driving these trucks to help keep things moving. So that's a whole other aspect of it.
And I mean, all of the entire immigrants are the bedrock of our economy. If we don't have immigration, it's going to be very, very difficult to survive according to the current standard that we're used to in the United States. And that's due to the number of workers, that's due to local economies, and not to mention taxing. So a lot of people who are not eligible to ever get Social Security or ever get any federal benefits pay in billions of dollars every year into those programs. And that is now going to become more difficult for them to do and much scarier for them to do because of the information sharing between the IRS and DHS. And so I think that it's really shooting ourselves in the foot purely in an economic. framework.
Right. I think the short term right now that we're seeing is the tourism numbers, which have been documented, in New York, Vermont, as well. But I'm sure you see a long term, right? There's a long term effect that maybe isn't felt yet, I'd imagine, and the economic.
Yeah. So one thing that is illustrative of that is from the prior administration or the prior Trump administration, because there was such because it was more difficult for people to immigrate. Um, the United States didn't bring in the same number of nurses and doctors that we had historically brought in. Most of the United States, I don't know if most, but a large plurality, if not the majority, of doctors and nurses in the United States have immigrant backgrounds and are from other countries. Uh, the when COVID hit in 2020, we didn't have enough nurses and doctors because of that. And I think that the extent to which the United States relies on immigrant labor is widely misunderstood